I am not your mother.
Mom, please!
I am not your mother.
Alliance! I cannot stand and watch this! Let them finish. We need full proof.
They reached the clearing, the air heavy with the scent of earth and leaves, the sun filtering through the thick canopy in broken rays. Amarachi steps forward first, a cruel smile tugging at her lips, and without a moment's hesitation, she shoves Ifeoma into the shallow grave they had dug earlier. Ifeoma's scream pierces the stillness of the forest, raw and terrified. Oh! No! Please! Her tiny hands claw at the dirt walls, trying to find patches, to escape the cruel trap. Above her, Nwakaego scoops up handfuls of sand and hauls them down with chilling precision. Mama, please! Ifeoma cries, her voice shaking with desperation, her eyes wide with pleading. Nwakaego leans over the pit, her gaze cold and unflinching. I am not your mother, she says flatly, each word a dagger of rejection. The soil falls relentlessly, covering Ifeoma slowly, pressing down on her chest, muffling her screams. Her voice weakens with every handful of dirt, until it disappears entirely beneath the growing mound. Silence descends like a suffocating blanket. Amarachi and Nwakaego step back, flattening the grave with their feet, their laughter sharp and cruel, echoing through the trees. Then, satisfied, they turn and leave the clearing, disappearing among the shadows of the forest. Hidden nearby, Prince Chidubem and his loyal bodyguard Obayagu have been tracking the faint cries. The prince crouches behind a thick bush, his dark eyes steady and observant. Obayagu's hands tremble with restrained fury, his voice low and urgent. My prince! Allow me. I cannot stand and watch this. Chidubem presses a firm hand on his shoulder, his voice calm but commanding. Let them finish, he says quietly. We need full proof. We cannot act on suspicion alone. Obayagu's jaw tightens, his breath coming fast, but he does not move. Chidubem's gaze remains fixed on the tragic scene, burning the memory into his mind. Before we continue with this old forgotten tale, dear viewers, kindly hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so yet, so you won't miss the rest of this story. Now, let us journey further into the forest to discover why a stepmother could be so cruel as to bury her stepdaughter alive, and for the prince who witnessed this abomination, what justice will he deliver upon Nwakaego and Amarachi? The forest waits, silent, holding its breath, as the story unfolds. Long before the forest swallowed her screams and before cruel hands pushed her into a shallow grave, there was once a little girl whose laughter danced through her father's compound like sunlight after rain. Her name was Ifeoma. She was bright-eyed, soft-spoken, and gentle in a way that made even the oldest women in the village smile whenever she greeted them. In those days, sorrow had not yet learned the path to her heart. Every morning, Ifeoma would run barefoot across the yard, her small feet kicking up dust as she chased butterflies or followed the chickens that wandered lazily around the compound. And always watching her with warm, loving eyes was her mother, Adis. Adis was a woman of quiet grace, the kind whose voice carried calm wherever it went. She believed deeply that a child's heart must be shaped with kindness before the world tried to harden it. Often she would sit beneath the shade of the mango tree with little Ifeoma curled beside her, braiding her hair slowly while speaking soft lessons into her ears. My daughter, Adis would say gently, tying the last braid with careful fingers, always remember this. Kindness is strength. Little Ifeoma would tilt her head and ask innocently, but Mama, how can kindness be strong? Adis would smile, touching the girl's cheek. Because only the strongest hearts choose kindness when the world becomes cruel. Another day she would add softly, and never allow bitterness to grow inside you. Once bitterness enters the heart, it poisons everything. Ifeoma would nod seriously, even though she was still too young to fully understand those words. To her, life was simple, her mother's laughter, her father's protective arms, and the warm safety of their small home. But peace does not always ask permission before it leaves. One quiet evening, Adis suddenly fell sick. At first it seemed like nothing more than tiredness. But the sickness grew quickly, draining the strength from her body like water leaking from a broken pot. The compound that once echoed with laughter became heavy with worry. Soon Adis could no longer rise from her bed. Ifeoma did not understand why her mother suddenly looked so weak, why her smile seemed softer, sadder. One night, the oil lamp flickered gently beside Adis' bed as the room filled with a quiet that felt too deep for comfort. Ifeoma sat beside her, her small fingers playing with the edge of the wrapper covering her mother. Adis slowly reached out and held the child's tiny hands between her own. Her palms were warm but fragile, like leaves ready to fall. She looked at Ifeoma for a long moment, memorizing the innocence in her daughter's face. Then she spoke softly, her voice gentle but tired. "My sunshine," she whispered. Ifeoma leaned closer. "Mama." Adis brushed a strand of hair away from the girl's forehead. "You must be strong." The words sounded simple, but they carried the quiet weight of a farewell. Ifeoma frowned slightly. "Why are you saying that, Mama? Are you going somewhere?" Adis' eyes glistened faintly under the lamp's glow, yet she forced a weak smile. "Just promise me you will always remember what I taught you." The little girl nodded quickly, squeezing her mother's fingers. "I promise." Adis closed her eyes briefly as if gathering the last of her strength, then whispered again, "Kindness is strength, and never let bitterness grow inside you." A long silence filled the room. Outside, the night insects hummed softly. Then slowly, gently, Adis' grip loosened. The breath in her chest faded like a quiet wind disappearing into the darkness. By morning, the compound was filled with mourning voices. Women cried. Men spoke in hushed tones. But Ifeoma stood near the doorway, confused by the sudden sorrow surrounding her. She watched as people covered her mother's body with cloth, and she tugged at her father's wrapper with innocent worry. "Papa," she asked quietly, "why is Mama sleeping for so long?" Obina's heart shattered inside his chest. The strong man who had always seemed unbreakable suddenly looked lost. He knelt down, pulling Ifeoma tightly into his arms as tears streamed freely down his face. He did not know how to explain death to a child whose world had just lost its brightest light. From that day forward, Obina carried a double burden. He became both father and mother, protector and comforter. And though he tried his best to fill the empty space Adis had left behind, deep inside he knew that some wounds in life never truly heal. But little Ifeoma, still too young to understand the cruelty of loss, continued to carry her mother's last words quietly inside her heart. And those words would one day become the only light guiding her through the darkest night of her life. Years passed slowly in Obina's compound, and though the pain of Adis' death never truly left him, life demanded that he continue. Little Ifeoma grew taller, quieter, and more thoughtful, carrying her mother's gentle spirit in the way she spoke and moved. But the villagers had begun to talk. At first it was soft whispers whenever Obina passed through the market square. Then it became open advice whenever elders visited his compound. One afternoon, as Obina sat beneath the old mango tree repairing a farming tool, two elderly men approached him and lowered themselves onto wooden stools. One of them cleared his throat and spoke carefully. "Obina, a man cannot raise a young girl alone forever. A home needs the hands of a woman." Obina sighed heavily, staring at the ground. "I have managed so far." The second elder shook his head slowly. "Managed, yes. But a child needs a mother's guidance. And you, my son, need companionship. The loneliness will swallow you." The pressure did not stop there. Women in the village began bringing suggestions, mentioning widows or unmarried women who might be suitable. Eventually, worn down by their constant urging and believing it might bring balance back to his home, Obina agreed to remarry. That was the day Nwakaego entered the compound. She arrived with graceful steps and a warm smile that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Her wrapper was neatly tied, her hair beautifully arranged, and her voice carried a sweetness that instantly impressed the villagers who had gathered to witness the new bride's arrival. But behind that elegant smile were eyes that remained strangely cold, as though warmth had never truly lived there. Beside her stood her daughter, Amarachi, a girl nearly the same age as Ifeoma. Amarachi's face held curiosity mixed with a quiet arrogance that seemed unusual for someone so young. At first, everything appeared peaceful. Nwakaego spoke kindly to Ifeoma during the early days. She would call her gently while cooking in the kitchen hut. "Ifeoma, come here, my dear. Help me wash these vegetables." Ifeoma would hurry over, eager to please, hoping perhaps that life was becoming normal again. Sometimes Nwakaego would even pat her shoulder lightly and say, "You are a good girl." But slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, small cracks began to appear beneath that gentle mask. During meals, Ifeoma's bowl always seemed to hold slightly less food than the others. When she hesitated, wondering if it was a mistake, Nwakaego would smile calmly and say, "You are still young. You don't need as much food." The words sounded reasonable, but the pattern never changed. Then came the comments that looked like advice but carried hidden thorns. One afternoon, while Ifeoma struggled to lift a heavy pot of water, Nwakaego shook her head disapprovingly. "A girl must learn to walk faster," she said coolly. "No man wants to marry a lazy woman." Ifeoma lowered her head quietly, embarrassed even though she had been walking since morning. Amarachi watched everything closely, learning quickly from her mother. Soon she began copying the same sharp tone whenever she spoke to Ifeoma. One day as Ifeoma swept the compound yard, Amarachi folded her arms and stared at her with mock authority. "You are too slow," she snapped impatiently. Ifeoma paused, confused. "I am trying my best." Amarachi rolled her eyes dramatically. "Trying your best? Is this how you think work is done?" Another day, when Ifeoma sat briefly to rest after carrying firewood, Amarachi walked past her and smirked. "You think this is your mother's house?" she sneered. The words struck deeper than Amarachi probably realized. Ifeoma felt her chest tighten, but she said nothing. She simply stood up again and continued walking. From the doorway, Nwakaego watched the scene silently, the faintest smile touching the corner of her lips. It was a smile that held no kindness at all. And though Obinna remained unaware of the quiet cruelty unfolding within his home, the gentle peace that once filled his compound had already begun to fade, replaced slowly by a darkness that would soon grow far worse than anyone could imagine. As the seasons changed and the years quietly moved forward, the kindness Nwakaego once pretended to show Ifeoma slowly disappeared like morning mist under the rising sun. What began as small corrections and hidden insults gradually turned into something far more cruel. Without announcing it, without any clear moment of change, Nwakaego began turning Ifeoma into nothing more than a servant inside her own father's home. Every morning before the first rooster crowed, while darkness still wrapped itself around the compound, Ifeoma would already be awake. The air was always cold at that hour, the ground damp beneath her bare feet as she swept the yard with a tired rhythm. Sometimes her small hands trembled from sleep, but she dared not slow down. If Nwakaego woke and found the compound unswept, her sharp voice would slice through the quiet like a whip. "Ifeoma," she would shout from inside the house. "Do you think this is a place for sleeping? Lazy girl." So Ifeoma learned to rise before everyone else, quietly completing her chores while the village still slept. She fetched water from the stream, balanced heavy firewood on her head, cleaned cooking pots blackened by smoke, and prepared the kitchen for Nwakaego before the sun even touched the sky. But the work did not end there. Throughout the day, there was always another task waiting. Another order. Another complaint. Meanwhile, Amarachi lived a very different life inside the same compound. On many afternoons, Amarachi would sit comfortably under the shade of the mango tree with a small mirror in her hand, carefully braiding her hair while humming lazily to herself. Her feet stretched out, her posture relaxed. At that same moment, Ifeoma could be seen returning from the stream, a heavy clay pot of water balanced carefully on her head. Sweat ran down her temples, her shoulders aching from the weight, yet Amarachi would barely look up. Sometimes she would glance sideways and shake her head with mock annoyance. "Why are you moving so slowly again?" Amarachi would complain. "Even an old woman walks faster than you." Ifeoma would lower the pot gently, breathing heavily as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. "The pot is heavy," she would reply softly. Amarachi would laugh dismissively. "Excuses. Always excuses." From the doorway, Nwakaego often watched these scenes unfold with quiet satisfaction. But whenever Obinna was around, everything changed. The moment he stepped into the compound, Nwakaego's voice would become sweet again, her tone gentle and patient. One evening as Obinna returned from the farm, tired and dusty, he noticed Ifeoma washing a pile of cooking pots by the well long after sunset. Concern crossed his face. "Ifeoma, my daughter," he called gently, "why are you still working at this hour?" Before Ifeoma could answer, Nwakaego quickly stepped forward with a sigh that sounded full of frustration. "Oh, Obinna, you don't understand," she said, shaking her head sadly. "I have been trying to teach this girl responsibility, but she is very stubborn." Obinna frowned slightly. "Stubborn?" Nwakaego nodded with practiced patience. "Yes. She refuses to learn. I tell her to finish her chores early, but she delays everything. Sometimes I wonder if she even listens to what I say." Obinna turned to look at Ifeoma, his expression puzzled but calm. "Is this true, my daughter?" Ifeoma felt the words rise to her lips, the truth trembling inside her chest. She wanted to explain everything. She wanted to tell him about the endless chores, the insults, the long hours of work. But when she saw the tiredness in her father's eyes, she swallowed the truth quietly. She forced a small smile and lowered her head. "I will try to do better, Papa," she said softly. Obinna sighed gently and patted her shoulder. "Good girl. Listen to your mother." The words pierced Ifeoma's heart, but she remained silent. From behind Obinna, Nwakaego's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. And so the days continued in the same painful rhythm. Early morning chores. Endless errands. Late night cleaning under the dim glow of a small oil lamp. While the rest of the household slept peacefully, Ifeoma often remained awake, scrubbing pots or sweeping the yard beneath the quiet stars. Yet through it all, she never complained. She carried her suffering silently, choosing to protect her father's fragile peace rather than burden him with the truth. Little did she know that the cruelty growing inside that house had not yet reached its darkest point. The afternoon sun hung quietly over the village when the sound of hurried footsteps began to echo down the dusty path leading to Obinna's compound. A small crowd was gathering, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Then the gate swung open, and several village youths appeared, their faces heavy with shock and sorrow. Between them, carried carefully on a wooden stretcher, lay the still body of Obinna. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his face pale and unmoving. One of the young men wiped sweat from his forehead and spoke in a low voice that carried across the silent compound. "Snake bite," he said sadly. "We found him near the farm. The snake struck him before anyone could help. He died instantly." The words had barely settled in the air when Ifeoma stepped forward from the doorway, confusion written across her young face. At first she did not understand what she was seeing. But when her eyes fell on her father's lifeless body, something inside her broke. A piercing scream tore from her chest. "Papa!" She rushed forward, pushing past the youth as they lowered the stretcher to the ground. Dropping to her knees beside him, she grabbed his shoulders desperately, shaking him as if she could wake him from sleep. "Papa, wake up! Papa, please!" Her small hands clung tightly to his wrapper as tears poured down her face. But Obinna did not move. His body remained cold and silent. The compound filled with the sounds of mourning women arriving, their voices rising in sorrowful cries. But among them, Nwakaego suddenly threw herself forward dramatically, wailing loudly as though her heart had shattered into pieces. "Obinna! My husband," she cried, beating her chest with exaggerated grief. "Why did you leave me like this?" Her voice rose higher and louder with every word, yet her tears seemed strangely forced, her sorrow almost too perfect, like an actor performing on a stage. Some women rushed to hold her as she continued her loud lament. Nearby, Amarachi stood watching the scene with wide eyes, but there were no tears on her face. Instead of sorrow, her expression carried something closer to curiosity, as if she were studying the chaos unfolding around her. She tilted her head slightly, observing Ifeoma clinging to her father's body with silent fascination. As the hours passed, preparations for the burial began. The atmosphere in the compound grew heavier with every passing moment. The men dug the grave while the elders spoke quietly among themselves. The sun slowly sank toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the gathering crowd. When the time came, Obinna's body was carefully lowered into the earth. The sound of soil hitting the wooden coffin echoed with dull finality. Ifeoma stood near the edge of the grave, trembling as though the ground beneath her feet might disappear at any moment. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her voice almost gone from screaming. As the last shovels of soil covered the grave, she stepped closer and knelt beside it, pressing her small hands against the fresh mound of earth. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs as she leaned forward, her voice barely more than a fragile whisper. "Papa," her fingers curled into the soil as though trying to hold on to something already lost. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she lowered her head against the grave. "Papa, don't leave me alone." The wind passed softly through the compound, carrying her broken whisper into the fading evening. But the man who had once been her shield, her comfort, and her only protection was now gone forever. And the lonely darkness waiting ahead of Ifeoma had only just begun. The soil on Obinna's grave had barely settled before the cruelty inside his compound began to grow like a weed left untended. The quiet respect people showed during the mourning days faded quickly, and once the visitors stopped coming, the true nature of Nwakaego revealed itself without shame or disguise. Ifeoma noticed the change almost immediately. The food that was once shared among them suddenly became scarce whenever it was her turn to eat. At mealtimes, Nwakaego would serve herself and Amarachi first, filling their bowls generously while Ifeoma waited silently nearby. When her turn finally came, the portion dropped into her bowl was always small, barely enough to quiet the hunger in her stomach. One evening, Ifeoma stared quietly at the thin scoop of food in her bowl and gathered the courage to speak. "Mama, may I have a little more?" she asked softly. Nwakaego looked at her with open irritation. "More," she scoffed sharply. "For what exactly? Have you done enough work to deserve more food?" Ifeoma lowered her head quickly. "I worked all day," she whispered. Amarachi burst into laughter, leaning back against the wall with amusement shining in her eyes. "Listen to her," she mocked. "She thinks sweeping and carrying water is hard work." Nwakaego's lips curled with cold contempt as she pointed toward the door. "If you are still hungry, maybe you should work harder tomorrow," she said cruelly. "Or perhaps you inherited laziness from your useless mother." The words struck like a slap. Ifeoma froze, her chest tightening painfully. Nwakaego continued without mercy. "Yes," she said harshly, her voice rising with open bitterness. "You are just as useless as that dead woman who gave birth to you." Amarachi clapped her hands in wicked amusement, laughing loudly. "Useless like her dead mother," she repeated mockingly. Ifeoma's fingers tightened around the edge of her bowl as tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry in front of them. She swallowed the insult silently, just as she swallowed the small portion of food given to her. But the cruelty did not end with insults. Soon Nwakaego began sending Ifeoma on errands at the most unreasonable hours, tasks designed not just to keep her busy but to break her spirit completely. One night the sky darkened suddenly as heavy clouds rolled across the horizon. The wind howled through the compound, rattling doors and shaking the trees. Soon thunder cracked loudly across the sky, followed by sheets of rain pouring down in violent waves. Inside the house, Amarachi sat comfortably near the fire while Nwakaego adjusted her wrapper against the cold. Meanwhile, Ifeoma was trying to rest in a corner after a long day of endless chores. Suddenly Nwakaego turned toward her with a sharp voice. "Ifeoma." Ifeoma sat up quickly. "Yes, Mama." Nwakaego pointed toward the empty clay pot beside the wall. "Go and fetch water from the stream." Ifeoma blinked in shock. Outside, lightning flashed across the sky and thunder roared again. "Now?" she asked timidly. "Yes, now." Nwakaego snapped impatiently. "Or have you suddenly gone deaf?" Ifeoma hesitated, her eyes moving nervously toward the storm raging outside. "But the rain is very heavy," Amarachi interrupted with a mocking laugh. "What are you afraid of?" she sneered. "Are you made of salt that you will melt in the rain?" Nwakaego folded her arms firmly. "If you are still standing here in the next minute," she warned coldly, "you will sleep outside tonight." Fear pushed Ifeoma to her feet immediately. She picked up the clay pot and stepped out into the raging storm. The rain struck her body like sharp needles, soaking her clothes within seconds. Thunder exploded overhead as she hurried down the slippery path toward the stream, her small figure struggling against the wind. From a distance, a few villagers noticed the lonely silhouette moving through the storm. One elderly woman standing under her roof watched with concern. "Is that not Obina's daughter?" she murmured sadly. A man beside her sighed heavily. "Yes. That girl suffers too much in that house." The woman shook her head with pity. "Someone should speak to Nwakaego." But the man looked away quietly. "It is not our place to interfere in another man's household," he said with uneasy resignation. And so they watched from a distance as the small figure of Ifeoma disappeared into the dark rain, carrying a burden far heavier than the clay pot on her head. In that moment, the entire village could see the suffering of the orphan girl. Yet fear and silence kept them all from stepping forward to help. When night fell over the village and every compound grew quiet, when the cooking fires faded and the last voices disappeared into sleep, that was when Ifeoma's lonely ritual began. Silently, she would rise from the small mat where she slept, careful not to make a sound that might wake Nwakaego or Amarachi. The moonlight would spill faintly into the compound as she stepped outside, her small feet moving slowly across the cool earth. Her destination was always the same place. Her father's grave. The mound of soil had settled now, the fresh earth hardened by weeks of sun and rain, but to Ifeoma it was still the closest place to the only person who had ever truly protected her. She would kneel beside it, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold together a heart that had been breaking for too long. Sometimes she spoke softly into the quiet night, her voice trembling with the pain she could not share with anyone else. "Papa," she would whisper, staring at the silent mound of earth. "Papa, I am tired." The wind would move gently through the trees as if listening to her sorrow. Her voice would grow weaker as tears gathered in her eyes. "They hate me, Papa," she would confess in a fragile whisper. "I try to do everything they ask, but they still hate me." Often she would sit there for hours, talking to the grave as though her father could still hear every word. On some nights the exhaustion from endless work would overwhelm her completely. Her head would slowly lower onto the cool soil until she drifted into sleep beside the grave itself. Fireflies would flicker quietly around her in the darkness, tiny lights floating through the night like silent guardians watching over the lonely child curled beside her father's resting place. It was one of those quiet nights when the moon hung high above the compound that Amarachi happened to wake unexpectedly. As she stepped outside to relieve herself, her sharp eyes caught a faint movement near the gate. She paused, narrowing her gaze. There was Ifeoma, slipping out quietly into the night like a shadow. Amarachi frowned with curiosity. "Where is she going at this hour?" she murmured under her breath. Carefully, she followed from a distance, moving quietly enough that Ifeoma never noticed the footsteps behind her. When Ifeoma reached the grave and knelt down, Amarachi stopped behind a nearby tree, watching silently. She listened as Ifeoma's tired voice drifted through the night. "Papa, I don't know how much longer I can do this," Ifeoma whispered weakly. "Every day feels heavier than the last." Amarachi's face hardened with cold amusement. She stayed hidden until Ifeoma eventually fell asleep on the grave once again, her cheek resting against the soil. Then Amarachi quietly turned and returned to the house. The next morning, as Nwakaego sorted dried peppers in the kitchen hut, Amarachi leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Mama," she said, glancing toward the compound entrance to ensure Ifeoma was not nearby. "Do you know what your dear stepdaughter does every night?" Nwakaego barely looked up. "What nonsense are you talking about?" Amarachi smirked slightly. "She sneaks out to the grave. She talks to her dead father like a mad person, and then she sleeps there." Nwakaego paused slowly, her hands becoming still as her eyes narrowed with irritation. "So even the dead man cannot give me peace," she muttered coldly. Amarachi leaned closer, her voice dropping into something darker. "Mama, why do we still keep her here?" Nwakaego's gaze sharpened. "What are you suggesting?" Amarachi tilted her head slightly, a calculating smile appearing on her lips. "What if she simply disappears?" The words hung in the air like a quiet storm gathering strength. Nwakaego studied her daughter carefully. "Disappear," she repeated slowly. Amarachi shrugged lightly, as though the idea carried no real weight. "People disappear sometimes. Perhaps she ran away. Perhaps she got lost in the forest." A slow, chilling smile spread across Nwakaego's face as the idea settled in her mind. She lowered her voice even further. "And how exactly would this happen?" Amarachi leaned closer and whispered, "We take her to the forest. Deep enough where no one goes." And then, she let the sentence fade, but the meaning was already clear. That same afternoon, under the excuse of gathering firewood, Nwakaego and Amarachi walked quietly into the forest. The deeper they moved among the tall trees, the darker the path became, until the sounds of the village faded behind them. Finally they stopped in a quiet clearing where the ground was soft. Amarachi picked up a small digging tool while Nwakaego began clearing leaves from the soil. Slowly, silently, they dug a shallow pit into the earth. The hole grew wider and deeper with every strike of the tool, until it was just large enough for a human body. Sweat formed on their foreheads, but neither of them spoke for a long time. At last Amarachi stepped back, breathing heavily as she stared at the dark hollow in the ground. The grave waited silently beneath the trees, hidden from the world. Nwakaego wiped the dirt from her hands and looked down into it with cold satisfaction. "Yes," she murmured quietly. "This would do perfectly." Above them, the wind rustled through the branches as though the forest itself understood the terrible plan being prepared beneath its shadow. The grave was ready. Now all they needed was Ifeoma. The strange kindness began that morning, so unusual that it unsettled the air inside the compound. For the first time in many months, Nwakaego called Ifeoma with a voice that carried no sharp edges. "Ifeoma," she said calmly from the doorway of the kitchen hut, "come here." Ifeoma approached slowly, her eyes cautious, her hands still wet from washing pots. Nwakaego held out a small bowl of food, something richer than the thin portions she usually received. "Eat," she said simply. Ifeoma hesitated, glancing between Nwakaego and Amarachi, who stood nearby watching with an unreadable expression. "For me?" Ifeoma asked quietly. Amarachi forced a small smile. "Of course it is for you. Why are you staring at it like a stranger?" Ifeoma took the bowl carefully, confusion flickering across her face. She ate slowly, unsure whether to feel grateful or afraid. When she finished, Nwakaego wiped her hands on her wrapper and spoke again with surprising gentleness. "Today we are going to the forest to gather firewood together," she said. You should come with us. Ifeoma blinked in surprise. Usually she was sent alone for such tasks while they remained behind. Something about the sudden kindness made her uneasy, yet deep inside a small spark of hope began to rise. Perhaps they had changed. Perhaps the cruelty was finally ending. Yes. Mama, she said softly. The word felt fragile in her mouth. The three of them left the compound together, walking down the narrow path that led toward the forest. At first the village sounds followed them, the distant chatter of women, the faint laughter of children, but as they moved deeper among the trees, the world grew quieter. The forest seemed unusually still that afternoon. Even the birds were silent. Ifeoma walked behind them carrying a small rope for bundling firewood, her eyes moving cautiously around the darkening trees. We are going very far today, she murmured. Amarachi glanced back briefly. The best firewood grows deeper inside, she replied casually. Soon they stepped into a small clearing where the earth looked strangely disturbed. Ifeoma slowed down slightly, her heart beginning to beat faster as a strange feeling crept over her. Before she could speak, Amarachi suddenly turned and shoved her with sudden force. Now! Amarachi shouted. Ifeoma stumbled forward in shock, her foot slipping on loose soil as the ground vanished beneath her. She fell hard into the shallow grave with a cry of terror. Oh! Her hands scrambled desperately against the dirt walls as panic exploded inside her chest. What are you doing? She screamed, her voice trembling with fear. Above her, Amarachi stood at the edge of the pit, breathing heavily, while Nwakaego calmly picked up a handful of loose soil. Ifeoma's eyes widened in horror as realization crashed over her like a storm. Mama, she gasped, her voice shaking. Nwakaego's face hardened into something cold and merciless. Without hesitation she began throwing sand into the grave. The soil struck Ifeoma's legs first, then her waist. Mama, please. Ifeoma cried desperately, reaching her arms upward. Please don't do this. I will do anything you ask. Please. Nwakaego paused only long enough to look down at her with icy contempt. I am not your mother, she said flatly. Then she continued throwing more soil. Amarachi joined her, shoveling dirt into the pit with quick movements. Ifeoma clawed helplessly at the rising earth, her cries growing more frantic. Please. Somebody help me. Mama, please. The soil climbed higher, pressing against her chest, her arms growing weaker as fear tightened around her throat. Dirt began falling onto her shoulders, her neck, her face. Her voice grew softer, choking through the falling sand. Please. I don't want to die, the earth continued to pour down relentlessly. Soon only her trembling hands remained visible above the rising mound. They struggled desperately for a moment before slowly disappearing beneath the soil. Her voice became muffled beneath the weight of the dirt. Mama, Piali, then nothing. Silence settled over the clearing like a heavy curtain. For a few seconds, neither woman moved. Then Amarachi suddenly burst into laughter, a sharp cruel sound that echoed through the trees. Nwakaego chuckled coldly beside her. Together they used their feet to flatten the loose soil, pressing it firmly until the disturbed ground looked almost natural again. Nwakaego brushed the dirt from her hands and stepped back, satisfied. Amarachi smirked as she looked down at the newly formed grave. Finally, she said with a small laugh. Without another word, the two of them turned and walked away, disappearing slowly between the silent trees, leaving the forest behind them quiet once more. Beneath the flattened soil, the earth held its terrible secret. Not far from that silent clearing, another pair of footsteps moved carefully through the forest. Prince Chidubem had always been known for his adventurous spirit. Though he lived within the comfort and protection of the palace, he often escaped into the wild forest beyond the village walls, not out of duty, but for the thrill of the hunt and the peace that nature offered him. Yet beneath that love for adventure was a thoughtful mind, one that observed the world carefully and weighed every decision before acting. Beside him walked his loyal bodyguard, Nwakaego, a tall, broad-shouldered warrior whose watchful eyes never relaxed, even during the prince's most casual outings. Nwakaego had sworn his life to protect Chidubem, and he treated that duty with unshakable seriousness. That afternoon the two men had ventured deep into the forest, bows slung across their shoulders as they followed the faint tracks of a small antelope that had passed through earlier. The forest was unusually still, the air heavy and quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves beneath their feet. Suddenly, the silence broke. A faint scream drifted through the trees. Both men froze instantly. "Did you hear that?" Nwakaego asked, his voice low and alert. The scream came again, weak but desperate, echoing faintly through the thick forest. "Please. Somebody help me." Chidubem's expression sharpened immediately. "That is not the cry of an animal," he said quietly. Nwakaego's hand moved instinctively toward the knife at his waist. "It sounds like a child." The scream rose again, trembling with terror. Without another word, the two men began moving toward the sound, stepping carefully between the trees, their senses sharpened by the urgency in the voice they had heard. The closer they moved, the clearer the cries became, though they were growing weaker with each passing moment. Soon they slowed to a cautious halt behind a thick cluster of bushes. Through the leaves, they could see a small clearing ahead. What they saw there made Nwakaego's blood boil instantly. Two women stood beside a shallow pit in the earth. Inside that pit was a young girl struggling desperately as soil rained down on her body. The women were burying her alive. Nwakaego's eyes widened with fury. His grip tightened around his knife as he stepped forward instinctively. "My prince, allow me," he whispered fiercely. "This is an abomination." But before he could move another step, Chidubem's hand shot out, gripping his arm firmly. "Wait," the prince said quietly, his voice calm but commanding. Nwakaego stared at him in disbelief. "Wait," he hissed under his breath. "They are killing her." Chidubem's eyes remained fixed on the terrible scene unfolding before them. The girl's desperate cries were already beginning to weaken as more soil covered her body. His jaw tightened, but he did not move. "If we rush out now," he said quietly, "they will deny everything." Nwakaego's breathing grew heavy with anger. "My prince, let them finish," Chidubem interrupted firmly, his voice low but resolute. Nwakaego looked at him, stunned. Chidubem's gaze remained steady, watching every movement in the clearing with cold focus. "I want full proof of what they are doing," he said quietly. In the clearing, the woman continued throwing soil into the pit while the girl's cries faded beneath the growing mound of dirt. The prince's face hardened as he witnessed every moment of the cruel act, committing the scene deeply into his memory. Beside him, Nwakaego trembled with restrained rage, his muscles tense like a warrior ready to explode. And so the two men remained hidden among the trees, silently watching the terrible crime unfold until the final shovels of earth sealed the grave and the cruel laughter of the woman echoed through the forest. For several long seconds after the cruel laughter of the two women faded into the distance, the forest remained eerily silent. Prince Chidubem's eyes stayed fixed on the freshly flattened soil as if the ground itself might suddenly speak. Then he exhaled sharply and stepped out from the bushes. "Now," he said firmly. Nwakaego needed no further command. The furious restraint he had been holding back exploded into action as he rushed to the grave. "Spirits, forgive this wickedness," he muttered angrily, dropping to his knees and clawing at the dirt with both hands. Chidubem joined him immediately, pushing aside the loose soil as fast as he could. The earth was still soft, freshly packed by careless feet. "Dig faster," Nwakaego urged breathlessly. "She cannot have much air left." Their hands moved desperately, throwing sand aside in frantic handfuls. The tension was suffocating. Each moment that passed felt like a race against death itself. Suddenly Nwakaego's fingers struck something. "My prince," he shouted. "I feel her." Together they cleared the remaining dirt, revealing a small arm buried beneath the soil. Chidubem brushed the sand away carefully until Ifeoma's face appeared, pale and still beneath the dust. For a terrifying moment she did not move. Obayagu froze. Is she? Before he could finish the sentence, Chidubem pressed his fingers gently near her nose. He held his breath. Then he felt it. A faint, fragile warmth of air. She is breathing, Chidubem said urgently. But very weakly. Relief flashed across Obayagu's face as they lifted her carefully from the shallow grave. Ifeoma's body felt frighteningly light, her limbs limp with exhaustion and suffocation. Dirt clung to her hair and face as her head fell weakly against the prince's arm. Without hesitation, Chidubem removed the royal cloak draped over his shoulders and wrapped it around her fragile body. "We must move quickly," he said. Obayagu nodded immediately. The palace. But before Obayagu could offer to carry her, Chidubem had already lifted the unconscious girl into his own arms. Obayagu glanced at him in surprise but quickly recovered, stepping ahead to clear the path. The urgency in their movements left no room for hesitation. Branches snapped beneath their feet as they hurried through the forest, the prince holding the girl carefully against his chest while Obayagu kept watch ahead. "Hold on," Chidubem murmured quietly to the unconscious child as they ran. "You are safe now." By the time they reached the palace gates, the sun had begun dipping low toward the horizon. The guards straightened immediately when they saw the prince approaching with such urgency. "Open the gates," Obayagu commanded loudly. The heavy wooden gates swung open at once. Servants rushed forward in alarm as Chidubem carried the dirt-covered girl across the palace courtyard. "Send for the medicine man immediately," the prince ordered. "Summon Dibia Okeke now." The message spread quickly through the palace halls, and within minutes the respected medicine man arrived. Dibia Okeke was an elderly man with wise eyes and a long grey beard that rested against his chest. His presence carried a quiet authority that commanded respect wherever he went. When he saw the weak girl lying on the mat prepared for her, his expression grew serious. "Leave space," he instructed calmly. "Her spirit is struggling between this world and the next." The room fell silent as Dibia Okeke began his work. He opened a small leather pouch filled with dried herbs and sacred roots gathered from deep forest. The air soon filled with the sharp scent of crushed leaves as he ground the herbs carefully inside a wooden bowl. He mixed them with warm water and rubbed the mixture gently across Ifeoma's chest and temples. As he worked, he began murmuring ancient incantations passed down through generations of traditional healers. His voice rose and fell in rhythmic tones, calling upon healing spirits to guide the girl back from the edge of death. "Spirits of life, hear this call," he chanted softly. Obayagu stood near the doorway, his arms folded tightly as he watched anxiously. Even the prince remained silent, his eyes fixed on the still figure lying before them. Dibia Okeke placed a small bundle of burning herbs beside Ifeoma's head, allowing the smoke to drift slowly around her. He leaned close, listening carefully for signs of breath. The room held its breath with him. A long moment passed. Then another. The tension grew almost unbearable. Obayagu finally whispered quietly, "Will she survive?" Dibia Okeke did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed 2 fingers gently against Ifeoma's wrist, closing his eyes in deep concentration. Seconds stretched into what felt like eternity as everyone waited. The faint flicker of life inside the fragile girl was all that stood between tragedy and hope. And in that quiet palace chamber, the question hung heavily in the air. Would Ifeoma return from the darkness, or would the forest claim her forever? The first thing Ifeoma felt was warmth, a soft, steady weight around her, the gentle beating of a heart close to hers. Her eyelids fluttered slowly open, heavy with exhaustion and confusion. The pale light of the palace room filtered softly through the curtains, strange yet comforting after the suffocating darkness of the grave. Her throat ached, her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then she saw him, Prince Chidubem, sitting quietly beside the mat, his eyes fixed on her with calm intensity. Relief and fear collided inside her small chest. "Prince," she whispered weakly, her voice trembling. Where am I?" Chidubem leaned closer, his hands resting gently near hers without touching her, careful not to startle her. "You are safe," he said softly. "You are in the palace. No harm can reach you here." Tears pricked her eyes as confusion shifted slowly into memory, the forest, the grave, the cruel laughter, the suffocating death. She shivered and clutched the cloak he had wrapped around her. I, she stammered, her voice cracking. They buried me, alive." Chidubem's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides, but he kept his voice calm. "Tell me everything," he said quietly. And so she did. She spoke in trembling tones, her words spilling out like a dam breaking after years of silent suffering. She told him of her mother's death, of the loneliness she had endured, of the constant walk, the insults, the midnight errands in pouring rain, the cruel smiles, the cold words of Nwakaego and Amarachi. Her small frame shook with each revelation. I tried to be good," she whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "I tried to walk quietly, to not upset anyone, but they never stopped. They hate me, they want me gone." Her voice trailed into a sob, and she lowered her head against the soft cloth beneath her. Chidubem listened silently, his expression unchanging, but beneath the calm mask, anger grew like a fire he could barely contain. His hands itched to act, to punish, yet he remained still, letting her words confirm every cruel detail of the crime. After she finished, he spoke softly, almost as if trying to soothe a frightened child, though his voice carried the weight of authority. "Ifeoma," he said carefully, "you do not need to fear anyone here anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with hope tinged with fear. "Prince, can I go home now? Back to my father's house?" The words escaped in a small, desperate whisper, almost pleading. Chidubem shook his head slowly, his eyes deep and unyielding. "No," he said firmly. "Your home tried to swallow you alive. That place is not safe for you. It is no longer yours." Ifeoma's lips trembled. "But I miss it, it was mine, it may have been yours once," Chidubem replied gently, "but you will not return. From now on, the palace is your refuge. This place, this is your home." He leaned forward slightly, letting her feel the strength of his protection without pressing it upon her. Slowly, over the coming days, Ifeoma began to breathe more freely. The corners of her lips, so long pressed flat with fear and sorrow, began to lift. Her laughter, quiet at first, returned like the soft trickle of water over rocks. The palace, once unfamiliar and distant, became a place of warmth and safety, a sanctuary where she could begin to heal, where the shadows of her past no longer held sway over her small, brave heart. And in the calm of the palace, Prince Chidubem watched her carefully, his silent anger simmering beneath the surface, promising justice for the cruel women who had tried to bury her alive. Back in the village, the air was thick with whispers and speculation. Nwakaego moved among the neighbors with a carefully crafted sorrow, her voice soft and measured as she repeated the story over and over. "She ran away with a man," she said, tilting her head with a practiced look of grief. "She left in the night, no one saw her go. Perhaps she is with someone who promised her riches or protection." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Some frowned, a spark of suspicion lighting their eyes. "But could it really be that simple?" one elderly woman murmured quietly. "A child just leaves her father's home, in the middle of the night." Others shrugged, uneasy but unwilling to confront the stepmother. Amarachi, standing nearby, laughed lightly, a small arrogant tilt to her chin. "See, Mama. We did it," she said, her voice dripping with triumph. "No one suspects a thing. She is gone, and we are free." Nwakaego nodded slowly, letting the dark satisfaction settle in her chest. She smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Yes, my daughter," she said, her voice low and quiet, almost conspiratorial. And one day, you will not be just a girl in a village. You will marry a prince, someone worthy of our family's honor. That is our future. Amarachi's eyes lit up with imagined grandeur as she giggled softly. A prince. Mama, you really think so? Nwakaego's lips curved into a thin, ironic smile. Yes, she said, her voice laced with the cruel humor of irony. You will have what Ifeoma could never keep. The world is ours to bend as we please, if only we are clever enough. The two of them shared a small, dark laugh, the sound carrying oddly in the quiet village street. Meanwhile, the villagers continued their muted gossip, unaware of the truth behind the story, and convinced by Nwakaego's performance that the girl had simply vanished into the night. The irony hung thick in the air, one stepmother boasting of triumph over a child she thought gone, plotting for her own daughter's future, while the real story of cruelty, deceit, and near murder remained hidden in the shadows of the forest. And in that darkness, Ifeoma's absence was twisted into a tale of her supposed recklessness, while the women celebrated a victory they imagined completely unaware that fate had already begun to turn. Days turned into weeks within the protective walls of the palace, and slowly, carefully, Ifeoma began to breathe freely again. At first, she stayed quiet, her small hands fidgeting nervously as she moved through the grand halls, still haunted by memories of the forest, the grave, the suffocating soil. But Prince Chidubem did not rush her. He allowed her the space to find her feet, to find her voice. And so, in those quiet days, their bond grew naturally, like sunlight filtering slowly through heavy clouds. They began with small conversations, her voice tentative, almost shy, as she spoke of simple things, the smell of the wet earth after rain, the taste of sweet yam, the flicker of fireflies at night. Chidubem would listen carefully, his dark eyes softening with each word, occasionally offering a quiet laugh at her small, innocent observations. Soon, gentle teasing crept into their interactions. You are afraid of the smallest shadow, he would say with a teasing smile when she flinched at the sudden swoop of a bird. Ifeoma would bite her lip, cheeks coloring, yet she would smile despite herself. And you think you are brave, she would retort, her voice growing bolder. Their laughter mingled, warm and bright, echoing through the palace halls, and for the first time in months, Ifeoma's eyes sparkled with a light untouched by fear. Even Nwakaego noticed the shift, leaning against a doorframe one afternoon as Chidubem and Ifeoma chased each other playfully around the courtyard. My prince hunts no more, he said in mock solemnity, shaking his head with a grin. You have been haunted. Chidubem's cheeks flushed, a small, private smile tugging at his lips, and he looked down at Ifeoma with a tenderness he could not hide. In those quiet moments, he realized with a sudden, piercing clarity that he loved her, not only for her beauty, not only for her courage, but for the resilience that shone in her soul, for the softness that hid behind eyes that had seen too much pain. But love brought with it conflict, a storm he could not yet voice. How could he love a girl who had endured so much? Could he protect her enough? Could he truly offer her the life she deserved? Nights were sleepless as he wrestled with these questions, the image of her pale, dirt-streaked face in the forest haunting him, mingling with the warmth of her smile beside the palace fountain. Finally, one quiet evening, he led her to the palace garden, the air scented with jasmine and the fading light casting a soft glow across the fountains. He took her small hands in his, bowing slightly, his voice steady but filled with deep emotion. Ifeoma, he said, I wish to be more than your protector. I wish to be your companion, your partner, your husband. Will you marry me? Ifeoma's eyes widened, her breath catching in her chest. The word marry felt impossible, heavy with fear. I cannot, she whispered, shaking her head slightly. I am cursed. I was almost. I am not worthy of such kindness. Chidubem lifted her chin gently with one finger, his gaze unwavering. You are not cursed, he said softly, voice rich with certainty. Whatever you have endured does not define you. You are brave, strong, and the kindest person I have ever known. I love you, Ifeoma, and I will spend my life proving you deserve happiness, every single day. Tears welled in her eyes, her trembling fingers clutching his hands. She searched his face for any hint of doubt, but found none. The sincerity in his dark eyes, the warmth in his voice, the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers, it reached her. Slowly, cautiously, she nodded. Yes. I will, she whispered, a fragile smile forming. And in that moment, the palace garden seemed to glow with a new light, one of hope, love, and the promise of joy finally reclaimed. The sun rose high over the village that day, spilling golden light across every hut and path, reaching even the farthest corners where whispers had long carried tales of cruelty and disappearance. King Igwe Izudo's voice boomed through the streets, commanding every villager, young and old, to gather in the central square. Come. Witness a union that honors courage and justice. The order carried authority and promise, and soon the entire village streamed toward the palace courtyard, curiosity and anticipation written on every face. Inside the great hall, Nwakaego and Amarachi appeared, dressed in the finest fabrics their wealth could buy. Gold threads gleamed against rich velvet, and beads and jewels sparkled in the bright morning light. They walked with measured grace, heads held high, whispering confidently to each other. Everyone will see our daughter's beauty, Nwakaego said, a sly smile tugging at her lips. Amarachi twirled, her skirts brushing the floor. Yes, Mama. Finally, people will recognize our family's honor. Their laughter carried over the murmurs of the villagers, arrogant and triumphant, convinced that the girl they had plotted against would never return. The time came for the bride to be unveiled. A hush fell across the gathered crowd as the heavy silk covering the bride's face was drawn back. Gasps rippled through the square, sharp and collective, like the crack of a whip in the tense air. All eyes fell upon Ifeoma. She stood tall, radiant, her skin glowing softly, her eyes shining with a mixture of strength, joy, and grace that no darkness could ever dim. The golden light seemed to bend around her, highlighting the delicate embroidery of her gown and the gentle curl of her hair. Nwakaego's breath caught in her throat. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She felt her knees weaken, a sudden dizziness overtaking her as her carefully maintained pride and illusions crumbled in an instant. It cannot be, she whispered, clutching her silk-wrapped chest as the world spun for a moment. Amarachi trembled beside her, fingers twisting the edges of her ornate wrapper. Her eyes darted nervously between the villagers and Ifeoma, the arrogance she had worn like armor melting into disbelief. Mama, she stammered, unable to form a complete thought, her bravado shattered. Ifeoma stood serene, untouched by their fear or envy. Her gaze swept over the crowd, soft but commanding, acknowledging the villagers' awe and admiration without arrogance. Every curve of her posture, every calm breath she drew, radiated the quiet power of one who had endured suffering and emerged whole. For a moment, the entire square was suspended in the brilliance of that revelation, one girl who had been buried in darkness now standing as the brightest light the village had ever seen. The irony hung in the air like a tangible presence. The women who had plotted her demise were now dwarfed by her beauty, her strength, her very existence. And the villagers, wide-eyed and whispering, felt the weight of justice and triumph settle over the square as they gazed upon Ifeoma, the girl who had returned from the grave to claim her rightful place. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as Prince Chidubem stepped forward, his dark eyes sweeping over the gathered villagers. He raised his hand, commanding attention not with force but with the weight of truth. People of the village, he began, his voice calm yet carrying the authority of one who had witnessed evil and stood against it, I bring before you the story of what truly happened to Ifeoma, the girl you thought lost, the girl who endured what no child should ever face. He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. On a day that should have been ordinary, Nwakaego and her daughter Amarachi took Ifeoma into the forest under the guise of kindness. There, they buried her alive, hoping that no one would ever know. She screamed for help, she begged for mercy, and yet they threw soil upon her small body, laughing at her terror. Gasps erupted across the square. Women clutched their children, men pressed their hands to their mouths, some stumbled backward in disbelief. Impossible, a villager whispered. Another shook her head. That cannot be true. Nwakaego's face twisted, lips trembling as she raised her voice in denial. Lies. Lies. You accuse us falsely. She left on her own. She ran away. Amarachi clung to her mother, eyes wide, lips quivering, though the golden fabric of her wrapper did little to hide her fear. Chidubem turned slightly toward Nwakaego, whose broad frame stood rigid and unwavering. Tell them what you saw, the prince commanded. Nwakaego stepped forward, the anger in his dark eyes almost tangible. I saw it with my own eyes, Your Majesty, he said, voice low but firm. I saw them throw soil into that grave, I saw her tiny hands struggle against it, and I saw them laugh when they thought no one was watching. I swear before all here, this is the truth. The villagers fell silent again, eyes darting between the faces of the accused and the body of the girl standing before them, whole, radiant, and alive. King Igwe Izudo's face darkened, his expression a storm of fury that seemed to crack the very air. He slammed his hand against the ceremonial staff beside him, the sound echoing across the courtyard. How dare you, he thundered, his voice booming like the roar of distant thunder. How dare you harm a child under my protection, in defiance of the gods themselves? His gaze fell upon the trembling women. Drag them out. Nwakaego's knees buckled as she grasped at the sleeves of passing villagers. Your Majesty, we beg you. Mercy. We did not, Amarachi's voice squeaked, trembling with fear. Please, please don't. We will be good. But the king's voice brooked no argument. Drag them from this village. Let them never darken these lands again. The villagers watched in stunned silence as palace guards moved forward, strong hands gripping Nwakaego and Amarachi, pulling them from the courtyard. They struggled, they cried, they shouted, but the king's decree was final. The crowd remained silent, a heavy witness to the justice unfolding before them. Slowly, they were marched out, past the gates, beyond the reach of the village that had once been their home. Their last cries faded as they disappeared into the distance, vanished forever. Ifeoma's gaze followed them, calm and steady. There was no hatred in her eyes, no desire for revenge, only the peace of one who had survived and had finally been seen. Her small lips curved into a soft smile, and she whispered softly, her voice barely more than the wind through the trees. Papa. I survived. And in that moment, standing tall beneath the sunlight that bathed the courtyard, Ifeoma was free, free from fear, free from cruelty, free to live, to laugh, to finally breathe. The music swelled through the palace courtyard, drums and flutes weaving together a rhythm that made every foot tap and every heart beat faster. Villagers and palace attendants alike clapped, laughed, and swayed, caught up in the joy that had finally arrived after so many long months of sorrow and whispered stories. Prince Chidubem and Ifeoma moved gracefully at the center, their hands clasped, smiles wide, eyes shining with a happiness so genuine it seemed to make the sun shine brighter overhead. Laughter rippled through the air as attendants darted around, some carrying trays of food, others adjusting decorations, and a few teasing Nwakaego in playful jest. You are supposed to be the protector, yet here you are being dragged into the dance, one giggled, tugging at his shoulder. Nwakaego grumbled loudly, cheeks coloring, as the palace echoed with light-hearted laughter, the sound blending with the music into a tapestry of celebration. Ifeoma's heart soared as she realized how loved she had become, how even the once silent corners of the palace seemed now filled with warmth and approval. She was no longer a frightened girl hiding in the shadows of cruelty, she was a princess, her voice, her presence, her spirit cherished by all who watched her. And she did not forget where she had come from. Within the weeks that followed, she devoted herself to supporting other orphans, ensuring that no child would feel the fear and abandonment she had known. One quiet afternoon, dressed in her royal attire, she walked slowly through the village cemetery to her father's grave. The wind stirred gently through the trees, rustling leaves over the mound of earth that had once been the only place she felt truly safe. She knelt, brushing her fingers lightly over the soil. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness but of remembrance, of gratitude, of resilience. Her voice rose softly in the still air. "Kindness is strength," she whispered, the words of her mother echoing in her heart. "Evil may bury you, but destiny will dig you out. The eyes of justice never sleep." As she rose, standing tall in the golden sunlight, the palace gleaming behind her, Ifeoma felt the full weight of survival and triumph. The girl who had been buried in darkness now stood in the light, a symbol of hope, of courage, of the enduring power of goodness. And with every step she took back toward the palace, her laughter mingled with the music, her joy contagious, a living testament to the fact that even in the deepest shadows, life, love, and justice would always find their way.